I'm going to turn it over to Bill Dempster, our moderator for today's webinar. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks so much, Alison, and thanks to everyone at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. I'm CEO of 360 Public Affairs and have been honored to be working with the CCSN to help organize and facilitate a number of webinars on important topics like today's. As Alison, you said, this is a very well-attended webinar, and for those of you who have registered but are unable to participate live, looking forward to seeing your comments or participation on YouTube or on SlideShare. I'm going to set up today's topic with just a few slides to recap on where we are with respect to the proposed reforms and how the federal government reviews and regulates patented medicine prices in Canada today. And we also recognize that the CCSN has hosted several webinars on the issue, so we don't want to repeat what has already been said. We're going to do something a bit different this time. We're going to drill down on the global context of these reforms, as well as present and discuss a case study that pressure tests the changes as currently proposed. Now, as Alison said, get your questions ready. There's a question box that you'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel. You can ask them at any time, and I'll ensure there's at least 15 minutes at the end of our session to review your input and questions. We may go a little bit longer, so that Q&A period might actually start a little bit closer to 2 o'clock, depending on how we do with the panel, because there's a lot to cover today. So let's kick it off with just a few slides to talk about what actually happens today and what's going to happen going forward, and that will be explained more fully by our panelists. Quick recap, what is the PMPRB? The Patented Medicine Prices Review Board is a quasi-judicial federal agency. It regulates medication prices while they are under patent, and it reports to the federal health minister, and it does two things. First, it has a regulatory function, and that ensures that prices charged by patentees for patented medicines are not excessive. And second, reporting. It tracks the pricing trends related to all medicines, including generic drugs, and the research and development spending of patentees. So it classifies all medicines based on a level of therapeutic improvement, and I'll get to that in a second. And it's important to know that it's the ex-factory price that's regulated. It's getting out of the factory. It doesn't include things like markups and other fees that might be charged by wholesalers or pharmacies. And the PMPRB approval of the price is not required before sale. So you might have heard me say it before. They're like a roadside traffic cop that will catch you if you're speeding, pull you over, give you a ticket, but they won't actually, test your car to make sure that it can only go so fast before you can get on the road. So in the late 80s, when the PMPRB came into effect, it actually was the only organization reviewing drug prices. It went right from drug development to Health Canada review. The PMPRB, again, is not a separate step, but generally it happens at first sale that you have to report that price to them. And then patients got access to most products that were approved by Health Canada. But flash forward a few decades, and now we have literally dozens of organizations across the country that are responsible for evaluating clinical and cost effectiveness. That's both through public plans and private payers. Even within hospitals, they have health technology reviews that they do to decide whether or not they're going to actually fund or deliver drugs within hospitals. And we're not going to go through this. This is something that we presented several times in other webinars, but and many of you are already familiar with these. So, as I said, the PMPRB imposes a maximum non-excessive price by applying tests. First of all, on the left, you'll see level of clinical improvement. If it's a breakthrough drug, then it's the median international price. Substantial improvement, moderate improvement, and little or no improvement. Depending on how it's classified by a committee at the PMPRB, different price tests are applied based on what's already on the market and available. Or sometimes they'll have to go to an international comparison. And to do that, they look at 7 comparator countries, currently France, the UK, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the US, and Switzerland. It also engages in active monitoring of the environment. So the price can never be higher than the price of the highest international price. That's the golden rule of the PMPRB. The maximum allowable price is set at launch, so that's when you actually come out with that first sale. There are annual price increases that are permitted, but they are limited to inflation, and often they're not taken. And as we'll talk a little bit later, the price increases are not actually happening even under what's allowed. There's regular reporting requirements by manufacturers, and they look at 4 market segments. That's the retail community pharmacies, distributor pharmacies, and hospitals. And there's enforcement for non-compliance. So the PMPRB, again, I said it's quasi-judicial. They can engage in investigations, and they've got several non-compliance options. They can start a board hearing, and the board can issue an order to repay any excessive revenues that have been collected by the patentee, or they can engage in a negotiation with the manufacturer or the developer, the patentee as they call them, for a voluntary compliance undertaking to repay some of the money. The other option, of course, is the federal court. The patentee can appeal, or the PMPRB can appeal too. Health Canada has proposed several changes to the regulations that govern the PMPRB, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time this afternoon. 3 new factors are proposed as criteria. There's pharmacoeconomic evaluations with a quality-adjusted life year threshold likely to be included in the PMPRB guidelines when they're finalized. The size of market, like how much market or revenue is expected from a new product coming to market, and then what is the GDP of Canada. So that's to determine how much Canada can afford, and including the GDP per capita. There's some requirements to report to actually support these new factors for manufacturers. There's a revised list of comparator countries that would actually bring the maximum median price closer to the OECD. That's the list, the 31 or 36 developed countries in the world, closer to the median of those countries. There's information on discounts and rebates, so a requirement to report these rebates that we all hear about through product listing agreements and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, as well as rebates that are given to private payers or through copay cards potentially. All of that information would have to be reported up to the PMPRB, and there's no active monitoring of patented generics, so they're going to wait for complaints to come in for that. The list of comparator countries is going to change from the ones I just mentioned to removing the US and Switzerland and adding 7 new countries: Australia, Belgium, Norway, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, and Spain, which we will affectionately call the PMPRB 12. So I hope that was fast enough. 7 minutes. I think that's a record for flying through those reforms so quickly, because I want to get right into our panelists and introduce who we've got on the line today. Our first panelist is Neil Palmer. He's a founder of PDCI Market Access, which focuses on pricing, market access, and health economics. And Neil was a leader at the PMPRB, in fact, in the early days of the organization. And many of you on the line know Neil as an expert on pricing and reimbursement issues. Most notably, he's got a global perspective on pricing issues, which we're very fortunate to draw on today. Our second panelist is Dr. Carole Watson, National Director, Government Relations and Stakeholder Engagement at Janssen. She has a very broad mandate within Canada's biggest innovative pharmaceuticals company. Her work on strategic pricing and pipeline products put her in an excellent position to pressure test the proposed regulations with a case study that I've helped present with her in the past. Our final panelist, who many of you know in the cancer community, is Martine Elias, Executive Director of Myeloma Canada. Martine has extensive experience working in the health and life sciences sector. In the past few years, she's become a leading voice in the patient community on health policy. She led a broad patient coalition submission, the one in fact co-signed by the CCSN on the proposed regulatory changes. And she serves as a member of the PMPRB Steering Committee on Guidelines Framework Modernization. So a dream team panel for you, and I'm going to turn it right over to Neil. Neil, take it away.
Thank you, Bill. I have, I think, about 10 slides, and I'm going to go through some of the elements of the proposed regulations, and in particular addressing some of the information that's come out from PMPRB in terms of the potential impact of the reforms. So Bill has already summarized, I think, a good deal of what's going on. This is a schematic that I think you will see fairly often, whether it's from PMPRB. I think Carole may have it in her slide deck as well. But essentially, there are three elements. One is this new basket of reference countries, sometimes called external price referencing. That's at the top. Over on the left, we have the health economics and the market size adjustments, and then for what they refer to as Category 2 drugs, the application of the average therapeutic class comparison test. Combine all of these tests are going to lower the prices of patented medicines significantly. And based on our analysis, and I have a graph coming up a little later, somewhere between the median international price and the lowest international price, based on what we call the PMPRB 12, this new basket of reference countries. So when the first time we did a webinar like this, it was for CORD, and on the panel was myself, but also Tanya Potashnik from PMPRB, and she presented a series of slides, and I'm going to have, and that entire presentation and slide deck is available on the CORD website, and I know Bill and others can provide links if you don't already have them. But I'm going to address some of the slides that were presented on behalf of PMPRB, because I think there are a few issues that need to be addressed, and I'm going to try and bring some of those out in this discussion. So you'll see these slides, these light blue background slides are the PMPRB slides, and I have some annotations that go around it. So the first thing is, in this basket, the main problems with the current PMPRB framework, and they have a list of 5 things, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first one is that this basket, that what we call the PMPRB 7, the existing reference countries, is made up of premium price countries, including the US and international outlier. Well, one, we don't know what they mean by premium because they haven't really defined that. And we know, in fact, that those countries, the PMPRB 7, were meant to be a balance of high-priced countries and low-priced countries, and that the PMPRB established a policy many years ago now, when I was at the PMPRB, that prices on average should be at the international median, the median of high-priced countries and low-priced countries made up of the PMPRB 7. So that's been in place for a long time. So this notion of premium priced is to me at least a bit misleading. The next one is that based on the international price comparisons or reference pricing is based on list prices. In fact, that's true of all countries. So Canada, yes, references list prices in other markets, but that's for every country that does international price referencing, and every country does that except for the UK, the US, Sweden, and countries like Germany and Japan only do it for certain types of products or certain situations. But those that do it on a regular basis, and that's the vast majority of countries, they are referencing the list prices in other countries. They don't have access to the rebated or discounted, the confidentially rebated prices in those markets. So Canada is no different. So to say that this is a problem is again misleading. The next one is that for high-cost drugs, for many high-cost drugs, the only factor PMPRB can consider in setting the prices is the public list price in the PMPRB 7. Again, this is misleading. It's only the rare breakthrough drugs that are limited only to the international price comparison because they have no therapeutic comparators. All other drugs have therapeutic comparators for which a therapeutic class comparison test can be made. Now, in some cases, that test may not be appropriate, but the fact of the matter is that to suggest that the international price comparison is the only price comparison for many high-cost drugs is simply untrue. To give you a reference, in 2017, there was only one breakthrough drug, and that's from the PMPRB's annual report. In 2016, there were 3. In 2015, I think it was 1. You can go through the PMPRB's annual report, and you can see that over the last decade or so, the number of breakthrough drugs you can count on the fingers of one hand in each of the years, and often it's only one drug. So that's misleading. Sorry, I jumped ahead too much here. The next one is that all drugs are subject to the same level of regulatory scrutiny regardless of price, cost, and market dynamics. Well, that may be the case, but what what PMPRB is proposing is not less regulation, it's more for the vast majority of drugs, really only with the exception of drugs that are generics or authorized generics. They're proposing more onerous price regulation for all patented medicines. And so to suggest that somehow that there's going to be different levels of regulatory scrutiny, I think is again misleading. The overall impact is much more onerous price regulation for patented medicines. Well, that line moved down, but sorry, I'm moving the wrong way here. There we go. And then finally, the only absolute ceiling for existing medicines is the highest international price. Well, that's simply not true. Existing medicines are limited to both the highest international price and the consumer price index, and it must be the lower of those two. So again, misleading. The next one is this access to drugs. So PMPRB takes issue with and considers it a myth that new drugs won't come to Canada as quickly or at all. And they cite some numbers in their slides. But the problem is that there's no references for where these numbers come from. There's no time frame. There's no indication of the number and types of drugs that they considered new in each of these markets. Are these drugs that were ever launched in Canada or would be launched? Are they important drugs for rare diseases, high-cost drugs? We have no idea. Are they referring to the same drugs in each market? Is it common basket? And do the price discounts refer to new drugs or the more general price differentials for all drugs, new and existing medicines? So it's very difficult to make an informed assessment of this slide, which are presented as facts, but really all we have are some pretty arrows, and we have no way of assessing where these numbers come from or how relevant they may be. And so what we really need to do is to consider the evidence. And one place to do that would be a study put forward by the London School of Economics on the impact of external price or external reference pricing, also known as international price comparisons. And so this study is a systematic literature review. So this is, a very high level of evidence in terms of assessing these impacts. And what did this systematic review find? They found that the availability of pharmaceuticals and equitable access to medicines can be undermined through extensive reliance on external reference pricing or international price comparisons. Moreover, there can be a spillover effect resulting in launch delays and an unwillingness of manufacturers to launch in low-price countries. So that's what the evidence shows. And if we look at from the manufacturer's perspective, so we looked at the evidence from the academics. If we look at it from the perspective of the manufacturers, based on a survey from the cutting edge folks, they wanted to understand what launch sequencing was and what's the approach that manufacturers take in launching products around the world. And you can see that in the current world, Canada is either a first wave or second wave country. In other words, when manufacturers decide to start launching their products, invariably they start in the US as one of the first wave. And then some of the major markets such as Germany, Canada, and the UK would either be in the first wave or the second wave. And that's I think that's well understood. I know it's well understood within the industry, and this is, any time you're looking at when manufacturers are going to start launching their products, they always have Canada as either the first or second wave. Sorry, it just jumped ahead on me there. And so what's going to happen with the new guidelines? We risk going down a third or fourth wave. And that's because the prices are going to be pushed down so far that it's down into the other European category. And I've got a slide coming up that explains some of that. So the PMPRB talks about the financial impact being modest or gradual. And I must say, when this slide was presented, it was quite a shock, because it makes the claim that the impact of these changes will be modest and gradual, reducing average prices of patented medicines by about 11% over the next 10 years. Well, I haven't seen that proposal yet that reflects that. The proposal we have right now says that prices are going to drop by more than 20% to the OECD median, and below that once the health economics and market size and other factors are taken into account. And so it's difficult to understand where this comes from. We have not seen any proposals that would suggest this. And their stated position is that these new guidelines would come into place in 2019. Now, as a practical matter, that would likely get delayed out to 2020. But just the same, we don't have any proposals. No one has proposed anything that suggests this is going to be some kind of gradual change over the next 10 years with about a 1% reduction in prices a year over the next 10 years. What's being presented is a 20% reduction, greater than 20% reduction, beginning in year one that these things come into place. So if there is a new proposal, I think everybody needs to hear about what that's going to be, because right now we have two very different statements, one that says it's going to be gradual, another one that says it's going to be quite dramatic, and both cannot be true. So just going back to the impact of the PMPRB guidelines based on the international reference countries, this is a chart from the PMPRB's 2017 annual report. It's using IQVIA, formerly IMS, data, price and price points, and you can see Canada up here in red at 1, and these light blue countries are the current PMPRB 7 reference countries, and you can see the OECD median significantly lower down here. And so what does the new proposal look like? Well, these purple dots are the PMPRB 12. And the proposal is that all new medicines, and all medicine, not just new, all medicines must be at the OECD, at the median of the PMPRB 12, which serves as a proxy for the OECD. And you can see that the median of the PMPRB 12 is at 0.8 and the OECD median is at 0.81. So that proxy is very, very close. So all medicines must have their prices lowered to this. So this is already a 20% reduction in price. And then on top of that, there's the health economics, the market size, the therapeutic class comparison test that will push it lower. How much lower? We don't know. All we know is that it will be lower. So the impact is really significant. And to suggest that it's going to be some kind of gradual decrease and modest decrease over 10 years just flies in the face of these facts, which are, of course, completely different. So then there's this notion that the reason that all this is necessary is Canada is out of step somehow. That all these things are being done, and there's all kinds of things being done in other countries that are not being done in Canada, and that Canada is falling behind. Well, except that what this notion, the premise of this notion is that the PMPRB is alone in Canada. And Bill started out the presentation talking about all the other agencies and government players that are out there that have an impact on price. PCPA, CADA, the provinces, INES in Quebec. All these agencies play a role. And so when PMPRB suggests that opportunity cost and actual market prices are and the market's not informed of the actual market prices, that's just plain wrong. The PCPA, Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliances, and the provinces explicitly consider opportunity cost and are acutely aware of what the actual market prices are. So it's just completely wrong. Whether or not PMPRB is entitled to know that is a different question. And there was a legal case many years ago known as the Pfizer case, where the federal court judge decided that PMPRB does not only because it's not in the regulations, but because that's constitutionally is outside their jurisdiction. And PMPRB is now seeking to duplicate the roles not only of PCPA and the provinces, but also of CADA and INES in terms of the health economics. So, I think this is a great concern to the industry, and I think it should be of concern to patients as well, because they're going to use the same information and come to different conclusions, and assert that prices should be at even lower levels than what CADA and PCPA and INES are coming up with. So that's my presentation. I'll hand it over now or back to Bill, and I think over to Carole.
Thanks, Carole. And just say next slide when you'd like me to advance, if that's okay, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Can you hear me clearly?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So thank you, Neil, for walking us through, and Bill, through the changes that have been proposed, and then also some of the issues with the way the PMPRB is positioning these changes. And as working for a pharmaceutical company, and in my previous role, and even now, we're always asked, well, what do these changes mean for our company and for our products? And one approach we took to answering that question, both here internally within our company, but then also in discussing the changes externally with various stakeholders, was to work through a case study. So to take all of these changes and sort of walk through what could happen for a given product. And that's what we've developed, and Bill has helped us with that. And so a caveat with this is a hypothetical case, but the data that I'm using and the numbers are based on real products. And then also, because a lot of the changes we're still not really sure, and Neil highlighted a couple spots, what the impacts are going to be. I've made some assumptions along the way in this case, and I'll call those out for sure as we go along. So the drug we've come up with, we're calling it Nugevity, so it's a new cancer treatment. It treats the cancer with limited new options, definitely an area in a number of cancers that we at Janssen are working on, and other companies here in Canada. It's a relatively small population, 1,000 new working-age Canadian patients per year. It would be used as a first-line long-term therapy, so treat to progression, as they call it. And it's an oral tablet or tablets replacing an in-hospital IV infusion. So obviously, that alone is of value to patients. And again, like I said, this is a treatment that is increasing overall survival by 4 months, and this is a 50% improvement over what we see with the current chemotherapy option for this treatment. It also has been shown to improve complete response by 25%, progression-free survival of greater than 2 years, and fewer side effects. So patients can take it at home. They don't have to go to the hospital, and then there's less of those side effects that you tend to see with chemotherapy. So that's the sort of profile of this drug. So next slide, please. Thanks. So when we look at what would we do from a pricing perspective for a drug like this, we would look at, with the current regulations for PMPRB, we know that this drug would be we're assuming in this hypothetical case that it would be a breakthrough treatment at Health Canada. So Health Canada has deemed it as a breakthrough because there are no new options for this treatment, for this cancer. And going in as a manufacturer, we would look at the current regulations and we would say, okay, we can probably achieve the median price of the PMPRB 7, so the international median that Neil referenced. And in this case, that would be $5,000 a month. When we look at the cost effectiveness, and there's a lot of numbers on here, just all you need to know really is that the incremental cost effectiveness ratio is the relationship between value for the product and the cost of the product relative to what's existing. And the lower the number, the more cost effective the product is. So when we put together our model with the assumptions, we came out with a value of $125,000. And there's a range there because, again, these are models that are assumption-driven. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, so we have to make assumptions around that cost effectiveness. The health technology assessment done by PCODER took that model and they looked at it and they changed some of the assumptions as they do, and they came out with their answer being $215,000 per quality, and they had a range. A bit of a higher range than the manufacturer. And again, this is generally what tends to happen with these models. Different assumptions are used, and in this case, the difference was really driven by the time frame of the model. So how far out do you look? And so the next slide. Please, Bill. Thanks. Okay, so the next slide. So how would PMPRB look at this? Currently, and Neil and Bill went through this, they would look at what they consider the therapeutic value of this product and bucket it into one of 4 categories that Bill went through, and then the different price tests are applied. So next slide, I won't go through that because we did already. So with the existing guidelines, they're fairly straightforward, and although there's some uncertainty when you launch a product, because they've been in place for so long and we've been using them effectively, we're fairly certain that when we launch this product, we would be allowed to charge $5,000 a month for this product. and that price would be within guidelines because PMPRB would find this drug a substantial improvement. As Bill mentioned, the PMPRB doesn't start looking at the prices until after you actually sell the product, so we always have to launch at what we call at risk. But in this case, we'd be fairly confident that this would be allowed. The other point on this slide is that obviously we would then need to go and negotiate with the provinces in order to cover the product through the PCPA process that Bill mentioned and Neil. And right now in this example, we're assuming that we would need to provide a 30% confidential rebate with those public payers. And this is based on some data that has come out of Ontario. The Auditor General showed that that's the average discount that is being offered right now for all products. So we use that number as a proxy for this hypothetical case. So on to the next slide. So I showed you the figure of the existing guidelines. This is the figure of how the new guidelines will work that Neil walked through. So I'm not going to walk through that in great detail. Happy to answer any questions on it though later on. So the next slide. So what would happen here with this new process? So the first step that they will do is they will do a maximum list price assessment looking at the new PMPRB 12 countries. We saw the schedule on the previous slides. And as Neil showed, the average prices between what we have now and this new basket of countries is about a 20% decrease. So right off the top, with the new guidelines, a manufacturer would need to reduce the list price by 20%. So in this case, that would be lowering it from $5,000 to $4,000 a month. So that would be the first step. So the next slide. Now the second step is they then would take, so that applies to every drug. So then they would look at every drug and say, okay, are we going to categorize this as a category 1 drug or a category 2 drug? So these are the 4 tests on the left-hand side that the PMPRB has proposed as criteria for that categorization. Is it a first-in-class or a substantial improvement? Well, in this case, yes, we've showed that. Is the market size greater than $20 million a year in any of the first 5 years after launch? In this case, we multiply the number of patients by the cost at, again, using the $5,000 a month assessment point. Yes, that would be the case. Is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, the ICER, greater than 30,000 cost per quality? Well, in this case, clearly that is the case. And is the average annual cost greater than per capita GDP, which right now, I think when we did this, it was around 55,000 Canadian dollars. So that would be the case. So this drug would meet all of those criteria. Need to make the point, though, that you only need to meet one of these criteria to be put into Category 1. And it's Category 1 drugs that are most subjected to the deepest regulatory control over the prices. And when you see these categories, especially that first category, it's the drugs that are the most innovative and providing the most improvement that will be subject to the most regulatory scrutiny and therefore the most uncertainty when it comes to pricing from a manufacturer's perspective. So the next slide, please. So once they've categorized the drug, and in this case it would go into Category 1, they would then do what they're calling a maximum rebated price. So this is the price, so we've got our list price at $4,000 per quality if we look at the PMPRB 12. Now we're looking at what is that rebated price. And this is where we're getting into what is the mandate of the federal PMPRB and what is the mandate of the provinces who are actually negotiating these rebates. And this is where the PMPRB is starting to step into that realm of regulating rebated prices. So I'm quoting from one of the guideline documents, proposed guideline documents that came out. Category 1 drugs are subject to a baseline maximum value based on the price ceiling of $60,000 per quality. But they do say in there that there could be a higher quality threshold for certain drugs. It's not clear what that will be in the definition, but there's some language there around significant absolute gains in qualities or drugs for rare diseases, they might allow a higher threshold. But as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is all based on a health economic model, which are based on assumptions, and the results you get, even between different people using the same model, can vary greatly between HTA agencies. So here in Canada, we have two HTA agencies. We have CADIS, and we have INES, which focuses on Quebec. And I can cite examples where the disparity between those two agencies and the results they get in these models can vary by 10 or 100-fold. So when you're talking about a federal regulator who has quasi-judicial powers, it's very troublesome that they would be using an assumption-based model to assert that power. So the Health Canada assessment that they did for this proposal estimated that the average price reduction due to the cost effectiveness would be 40% below the PMPRB 12. So what we've done is apply that number as well as these thresholds, and at the bottom in the red you can see that the maximum rebated price would now be somewhere between $1,400 or $2,400 a month, depending on the threshold that's used from a quality perspective. And this is upwards of a 72% discount from the initial $5,000 a month that we had. And if you think about, originally we had assumed a 30% discount, confidential discount. You can see that this is quite a significant difference. So on to the next slide. So that's the pharmacoeconomics. They then are also looking at using GDP per capita and market size to further lower the price in some cases. Now in this case, this isn't that much more reduction, but it is more of a reduction when we look at these two, and it's very uncertain in the documents we have so far about how they're going to apply these factors. So we made some assumptions here that based on information in the documents that there will be a 10% reduction on that rebated price for each additional $10 million over that $20 million threshold. A lot of numbers there, but at the end of the day, it's lowering that price a little bit further for this drug longevity. So at the end of the day, we're netting out at a rebated price somewhere between $1,400 and about $2,100 per month versus the $4,000 we started with the rebated price and the $5,000 that we initially started at with the list price with the current guidelines. So on to the next slide. I know there's a lot here, so I'm happy to answer questions either during the seminar or later on if people have questions. So putting that all together, the proposed guidelines would reduce the price of this drug longevity by an additional 27 to 42% below the original estimated confidential reduction of 30%. So we started with a list price of $5,000, and we assumed we would need to rebate to $3,500. With the new price tests, the new basket of countries, and the new economic tests, it could be going down to $1,400 a month on a confidential rebated price of $1,400 a month versus $3,500. So the next slide. So thinking about that, I mean, on the face of it, one could assume that lower prices are automatically better, that it would enable drug plans to list more drugs and make more drugs available to more patients. And to a certain extent, that is the case. We've been working with governments quite closely since all of this started to work through a way to address affordability. And we have a long history of doing that already at the PCPA level, where we talk to the people who actually own the budgets, and they talk to us about their affordability issues and their budget constraints. And we work really closely with them to find those price points that still reflect the value of our products, but address the affordability concerns of the payers, both public and private payers. This is a whole other layer of uncertainty that makes it very difficult for an international company to launch drugs in a timely manner. And Neil showed some great academic research as well as practical research that shows the impact of what can happen. So when we walk through all of these steps, just sort of a summary slide of the way we, the challenges that we have to think about. So first of all, these results of these price tests can take a year or more after our first sale. So that's a layer of uncertainty that we launch at what we might think is the right price, and a year or two later we can be told, no, you're wrong, and now you have to pay back all that money. That's a lot of uncertainty for a company to manage. So what should we do with this case? Should we reduce the list price to $4,000 based on this new basket of countries? We could do that, but as Neil showed, that could cause problems in our international price referencing. And Canada is a small market relative to some larger ones, so a company may make the decision to wait to launch in Canada before those prices in those other countries has been established. And that comes to the second point. Do we delay that launch until after those other countries have launched? But that results in delay in access to Canadian patients here in Canada. And obviously, as a Canadian-based company and as a Canadian, we do not want that to be happening for patients here in Canada. Do we double down on it and reduce the list price to $4,000, but then offer those confidential rebates upwards of 60% that would be required? This is a difficult conversation with our global head office. We have a lot of difficult conversations with our global head office around those confidential prices. Sometimes PCPA is asking for prices that nowhere else in the world is asking for, and that makes it difficult. And sometimes it could happen that the global head office decides not to bring that product to Canada at all if that is the price point. That is devaluing the innovation and not allowing us to recoup our investments. Or do we launch at the price that we feel, this year in 2018 would have been the non-excessive price, but then we have a risk of getting into an excessive price investigation, which we want to avoid because we do want to follow the rules as they've been set out. So all of this uncertainty could result in this product being delayed in its launch in Canada, which is not ideal for patients. So next slide, Bill. So this is really a summary, and the example I've given is for a drug that would fall into that category 1. I do have a few slides about category 2 drugs, but Bill, I'll leave it up to you as to whether we talk about that now or go on to that later if there's questions.
I think we can touch on that a bit later, and why don't we turn over to Martine, and I'll look to some of the questions that people are already starting to put out, but let's try to reserve a couple minutes towards the end of the webinar to explain what happens with category 2. In fact, for the cancer community, most of the products that are coming would probably fall into category 1 for the reasons you gave. So,
for sure.
Martine, do you want to react to what you heard and actually kick us off into some of the questions, and then we'll turn over to the online audience?
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Neil and Carole, for an excellent presentation. I could say that, before, on a scale of 1 to 10, I understood a lot of the issues, maybe had it to a level 5, but you've increased my knowledge to maybe a level 6, just to say how complicated and complex this issue is. Even though I am a member of the PMPRB steering committee that is responsible for developing the guidelines and how to implement the regulatory changes that are proposed, I must say that this is extremely complex and difficult to follow. If you think about the pricing and the different factors that the PMPRB is proposing, those are, from a patient's perspective, extremely, difficult to understand. We're not pharmacoeconomists, we're not economists, and we're maybe involved in health policy, but our main interest is in minimizing the potential impact this may have. So just to go back to Bill's point, Myeloma Canada authored with a number of other patient organizations, there was 28 in total, a paper that we submitted to the PMPRB review process, the Gazette process, back in February of last year, and our position hasn't really changed since then. So what we said was that patients must be consulted, and thankfully, the PMPRB listened and included 3 patients on their steering committee. Now, there's only 3 and about 20 of other stakeholders, so you can imagine our voice is, not the loudest at the table, but we are there. And we cautioned the PMPRB about the possible consequences that their changes could bring. Carole really explained the impact of a particular drug, but from a patient perspective, we need access to drugs. We need them now, and we do not want to have any delays in terms of drugs being made available to Canadians. So any of the changes in our minds need to avoid any consequences that could delay drug access for Canadians, or even deny them altogether. The other consideration that we felt very important to mention was the access to clinical trial. And I think Carole and Neil also mentioned this as well, is that if the environment changes, the economic environment for pharmaceuticals to, be brought to Canada, that could potentially mean reduction in clinical trials and research. And remember, some of the PMPRB regulations and report back was the amount of clinical trials or research investments in Canada. So we certainly want to keep that and actually increase it if at all possible, especially in cancer where many patients depend on clinical trials as a treatment option, given that access can be challenging in the best of times. So we also agree as patient organization that access, affordability, and appropriate use must be addressed, and these are important to make sure that our healthcare remains sustainable. And we do have some concerns with what is being proposed, mainly from the impact it could potentially have. Now, Neil, I'm just going to touch on some of the comments that you made, and you debunk some of the myths that were presented by the PMPRB. So if you look at it from the patient's perspective, you've got Health Canada that is proposing a certain sort of position forward and is backing it up with some of the information or their analysis that they have done, which, by the way, we really have not seen and cannot comment on, with some of the facts that you've presented from some of your research and expertise. So my question to you is, what brings, you think, the PMPRB to have a very different position than the one that you have presented?
Thanks, Martine. Well, I think it's more a question of, PMPRB has and Health Canada, for that matter, have been very firm that prices need to come down to the OECD median, and they have been public stated on several occasions that would be more than a 20% or more than a 20% reduction, and that the value of that reduction is $3 billion a year. The slide that was presented at the CORD meeting to suggest that this would be some modest and gradual effect, I think, was a complete surprise to everybody. And as you on the steering committee, and others on the steering committee, I don't think no one from PMPRB has presented a proposal to say that this would only be a gradual reduction in prices. They're talking about an immediate reduction in prices down to the international median price. And that's dramatic. And yes, maybe there'll be transitional measures. Again, they haven't announced any of that, but those transitional measures are never more than a year. They're certainly not 10 years. Initially we thought back in December of last year that this would be applying to new medicines only. And then it was only new medicines that you could see the overall impact spread out over about 10 years. That would be fair. But in the middle of this year, I think it was in June, they announced that no, not just new medicines, all patented medicines would have to come down to the OECD median, or the median of the PMPRB 12, the proxy of the OECD, and that would be immediate, subject to some very short transitional measures. And then on top of all of that, the health economics, the market size, and this therapeutic class, average therapeutic class comparison test, which is in fact quite onerous for these category 2 drugs, that all these would have to come down. There's been presented no analysis or information to suggest that this would be a gradual effect over 10 years, and it would only impact prices by 11%. We've seen no analysis that supports that.
Thanks, Neil. Now, Carole, you really did a great job in walking us through an example or based on what the PMPRB had done in the past and what they're planning to do in the future, and that's something that we haven't seen is a live example of what the current or proposed guidelines would actually do. And one of that we've heard from the PMPRB and Health Canada as well is that if we could get to a better price, or putting products through the category 1, for example, we could potentially get those negotiations done up front, and therefore a drug could be made available right or very shortly after the drug is approved by Health Canada, which would give companies a much longer period of time to market the drug and to get it on formularies. Therefore, there would be some gains that would be made financially by bringing the drug sooner to the market. How is that? What's your reaction to that? And does that make sense from a pharmaceutical company to, maybe you don't have to wait as long, so therefore you can make up some of the revenues that you may have lost during the time in between?
Yeah, that's a great point, Martine. Obviously, being able to get the drug covered right at NOC and in the hands of patients is something that we would definitely strive for. We should all be striving for that, both from, mainly from an access for patients and the value to patients perspective. But you're right, not having to wait the 1.5 to 2 years it can take to get a drug covered by the public plans right now would be clearly an advantage that we as manufacturers would see would be of value to us, because obviously we could start making those sales earlier. I think the problem, though, when we have those conversations with regards to these PMPRB changes is a couple-fold. One, the PMPRB is saying, well, if we're the ones to figure out what that rebated price is, then you should be able to get it listed right away. But they only start regulating the drug once you're already selling it. Plus, you then have to report your rebated prices that you're paying already, so you can't actually do anything with the PMPRB until you're selling the drug, and you can't sell the drug until you get it listed by the drug plans, particularly in a case like this in the case of a cancer drug, particularly an IV one, if that was the case, where it really is only covered by the public plan. So it's a bit of a catch-22. The PMPRB, in their legislation, can only regulate the price of the drug for sale. So I think when they talk about that, it's a bit of a misnomer in the way that it's structured. And then secondly, the delays are really not at the Health Canada level with regards to getting coverage. It's really at the PCPA level, which is not anything to do with the federal government. It's regulated and controlled by the provinces. So unless the federal government, the PMPRB, and Health Canada can be more collaborative with their PCPA colleagues to bring all of that together and make that happen faster, these changes alone will not make that happen.
Thanks.
Thanks, both. And Martine, I hope you have some more questions. And maybe, Neil, you want to jump in there too. Just to remind people on the line that you have an opportunity to ask questions now. And there might be something, a challenge with the webinar, the GoToWebinar. So Allison, if you're still on the line, please flip me some of the questions that have come in. And in the meantime, let's keep this discussion going. We've got another 7 minutes or so. Martine, did you have anything else
hi there,
you wanted
Bill.
to?
Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Well, Allison, you're on. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we do have questions coming through. For some reason, you're not receiving them. I'm not sure why, but let's just run with this. If we'd like to give Martine another minute to say something, but otherwise I can just read out the questions and go from there if you'd like.
Sure. Well, why don't we put it back to Martine, and maybe you can just flip me a quick email with those questions. That'd be great.
Perfect.
Okay. I guess the last point I want to make is government, the PMPRB regulation are moving through. They are going to happen. The train is, has left the station. And so, at the end of the day, prices are going to have to change and be reduced, obviously. And from a patient's perspective, we feel that we're between the bark and the tree. And there has to be some give from all parties, industry and governments and provinces as well as patient organizations and patients as well, to play a role in this. And what I hope is that we can come to an agreement at some point in time, and there are some proposal put on the table. And I haven't seen, and I don't know if this is something that's relevant for patients to be exposed to, but some of the counter arguments or the counter proposal, maybe not the arguments, but the counter proposal that would have been put on the table by Innovative Medicines Canada. And I don't know, Neil or Carole, if you want to comment on this, but I think patients need some reassurance that there are some discussions to try to find a way to reduce prices of drugs.
So I'll jump in quickly and I'll pass it over to Carole. So absolutely, industry is in part you need someone to discuss / negotiate with, but there are discussions going on behind the scenes. I'm not party to those, but our firm has been doing quite a bit of analysis in support of some of that. I can't really comment more on any of the specifics, but let me say this. If PMPRB was to propose a 1%, they were talking about that the overall effect will be 11% reduction over 10 years. So let's say that's 1% a year over the next 10 years or 11 years, whatever it is. If they were to come up and say, look, why don't we reduce prices, the current prices by 1% a year for the next 10 years, and new medicines have to come in at the median of some revised basket of countries. Certainly the actual basket's a bit contentious, but what some revised, industry would, that would be far better than what's on the table today, in large part because of the uncertainty attached. And Carole touched on this. The uncertainty attached with the current proposals is a killer of in terms of putting products on the market. If you have uncertainty, there's going to be significant delays getting approvals at the global level to bring drugs to market if they don't know what the impact's going to be. If you say, yeah, it's going to be this price, and yes, you're going to have to reduce the price by 1% a year, at least there's certainty. They can make decisions very quickly, go, no go, etc. They won't be happy. There's going to be a lot of pain in terms of prices coming down. It changes the calculus in terms of market access and everything else. But at least with certainty, they can make decisions and make decisions quickly. And I can tell you it was simple and straightforward. There'll be an awful lot of progress on this file. But what we have right now is so uncertain that it makes it very, very difficult for manufacturers to make decisions about bringing products to Canada. And if they're uncertain, they're going to delay until they have certainty. Carole?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Absolutely. From a manufacturer's perspective, to your point, Eileen, or Martine and Neil, Innovative Medicines Canada, our association, has definitely been at the table with Health Canada and the PMPRB since this process started. And our starting point of those conversations always is, let's work together to find a way to lower those prices, to help with that affordability issue in a way that does not impact our ability to bring those products to Canada and cause things like clinical trials to be not as available in Canada and other things. So those unintended consequences. And we're not saying those things to be alarmist. We're looking at it, and I'm a very practical person, and looking at it from a very practical perspective, and that's why I tried to walk through a case study. I know it's complicated, but it really comes down to that big disconnect between the impact that PMPRB is saying around with that 10% over or 11% over 10 years or that kind of number versus the reality of when we look at what they've shown us what the impact will be, that creates a problem even right up front having those conversations, because it makes it very difficult to talk about what is the level of reduction that the government is looking for. So yes, absolutely, totally agree, Martine. The industry is at the table. One would hope that key patients and patient organizations can be part of that discussion. And I know, Martine, you're a great representative of that world at the level of the PMPRB, and I hope that the PMPRB and Health Canada and our industry will continue to make sure that that voice is being heard at that table.
Thanks very much, Martine. We're going to move on to some of the delegates' questions, and I've got some of your slides that we can go back to in a second on Category 2 potentially, but I'll wait actually for some of the questioners to say, hey, what about Category 2? Two of the questions that are coming forward, two or three actually, around timing. When are these new regulations going to be implemented? And we didn't go through some of the background of the different steps and when they occurred to actually put this forward by Health Canada and by the PMPRB. But the draft regulations were posted for public comment in December 2017. And the last update we've heard in terms of that exact question that came forward at the Health Committee actually just a couple of weeks ago, and this is the Health Committee at the House of Commons, the response from Health Canada was that the consultations, the submissions that came in from those consultations continue to be considered. So there was no formal commitment to when Canada Gazette 2, which is the final regulations, might be coming forward. Health Canada says that they're still considering the input that they received from the comment period that ended earlier this year, actually. The other questions that are coming through, in fact, I think you answered some of it, Carole, regarding clinical trials and access to clinical trials. There are a lot of cancer survivors on the line who are concerned about getting access to new oral oncologics and what that might mean for early access to even to clinical trials. And I think you touched on that, some of the tough decisions that you would have to make. But is there anything else you want to add to that right now?
I think, Bill, one point to make is that, Canada is a great place for the global pharmaceutical industry to do clinical trials. We have a great health system, we have great researchers. The problem that can happen over time, and it won't be overnight, but over time, is that if these changes happen and companies are unable to bring new treatments to market as quickly, Canada falls behind in the standard of care compared to the rest of the globe. So if a new treatment becomes the standard of care globally and it's not yet available in Canada, then it makes it difficult in the future for us to do a clinical trial where you need to compare the even newer drug to that standard of care. So the danger is that as we fall behind, or if we fall behind in standard of care, particularly in cancer, it makes it more difficult to bring those trial protocols to Canada. So that's again, this isn't something that we're going to lock all our doors and take all our trials away immediately. It's more of a gradual process, but that is one of the considerations to think about.
And Carole, a more specific question on the on your case study. Thank you for that. It's a little clarification because there were a lot of numbers there. If there's a price that has been agreed to that drops the 5,000 down by 30% average rebate, say like the high 3,000s, is that correct? Or are you saying that with the proposed changes, the drug will be approximately $1,400 to $2,100 per month, and then still be subject to PCPA negotiations, and so a further price reduction? And actually, that relates back to another question, which I thought was interesting. If this goes through, is there a real need for the PCPA at all, or is this in many ways the new PCPA? So why don't you handle the more specific question first, if you caught that, and then talk about PCPA.
Yeah, I know there were a lot of numbers, and I did go fairly quickly. Ideally, we would have a couple hours to go through all of this. That $1,400 to $2,100 would be the rebated price. So that would be the sort of the negotiated price if it was a negotiation. So that going from that what we thought was around $3,500 negotiated price down to $2,100 or even $1,400. So quite a significant further discount. And yeah, I actually have asked the PMPRB that exact question of, if you are doing this, do we need PCPA? And I don't think any person who works in, one of these agencies wants to admit that their agency is no longer needed, and the PMPRB wouldn't comment on that. But yes, I would agree. Is PMPRB now doing the work of the provinces? And I think back to the point Neil made earlier, is that the appropriate place for these pricing conversations to be happening, given that price is in the baby?
If I can jump in on that, if I can jump in on that as well, Carole. I mean, there's a complete different level of sophistication at the PCPA than there is at PMPRB, particularly when it comes to the health economics piece. PMPRB simply wants to take $1 per quality and make some adjustment to the price. The way at PCPA it works is that the manufacturer negotiates with the PCPA to find ways to improve the cost effectiveness of a drug. And I'll give you two examples of how that could work. One could be that the high end of the cost per quality range, or the incremental cost effectiveness ratios, the high end could be the result of a dosing range. So that, say the vast majority of people need a certain dose, but a small percentage need 2 times that dose. So instead of the $60,000 a year that Carole had in her example, some might need even $120,000. Well, the one way that the manufacturer will address that will say, well, we'll guarantee that the maximum price or the maximum cost for any patient is $60,000. So that takes out the higher end of the range. They may, and PCPA may come back, or one of the provinces may say, well, we think you've underestimated the number of patients. Instead of 500 patients, we think there might be 1,000 patients. And so the manufacturer will say, well, that's fine. We'll guarantee that there will be no more than, the total cost will be no more than 500 times the annual cost of 60,000. And that's the maximum cost you will pay, province, over the course of the year. PMPRB does not have the ability to do any of that. And so the way that the price or cost of a medicine, the cost effectiveness is improved at the PCPA is far more sophisticated than PMPRB can ever do. Moreover, the way PMPRB does it is in fact going to bring into jeopardize that whole process, because they're just going to force the price down so much lower, and it really jeopardizes this much more informed approach that goes on with PCPA.
Neil, it's Martine here. Would you say that this is the difference between understanding what the value of a drug is and deciding what you're going to pay based on the value versus deciding what you're going to pay based on cost?
Well, to the provinces and payers, that price is one thing, but really it's the overall cost. Are they getting value for the money, the value for money? And they're always looking at ways, and the manufacturers are doing the same thing. How can we either improve the value for money or ensure that they're getting value for money? And so the two examples I gave are by what we call caps, whether it's at a patient level or an overall expenditure cap. This is a very common form of negotiations that goes on with PCPA that's well beyond the analysis that PMPRB can do. But there are other ways as well. They can limit to reimbursement to certain indications within that cancer group, and that's very common. And they will often negotiate it just for those indications where the drug is most clinically effective, which is also where it's usually most cost effective. So this is very important. The price, notionally is important, but it's value for money that the provinces are looking at. PMPRB claims they're going down that road, but they can't, because they can't get into this level of discussion. They just don't have the ability to do that. So this is, why we're, I think manufacturers are so concerned about PMPRB weighing into this space, because it really will jeopardize the whole process that's going on with PCPA, and it creates a level of uncertainty that's just unacceptable.
Thanks, Neil. Carole, Martine, any final thoughts? We're recognizing that we're well past the hour now, and thanks to everyone on the line for putting forward some really good questions. We didn't get to all of them, but any final last words to the panelists before I pass it back to Alison and the CCSN?
Thank you very much, Bill, and I'm happy to, if you have the questions, always happy to try and address them offline.
Excellent. So on that point, maybe I'll flip forward to the final slide that just shares a few email addresses and other information about the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network, who you can send the questions to, etc. So Neil, Martine, anything else to take us home?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity to have the patient voice heard.
No, thank you, Bill. No, happy to, if there's any other further questions, please please forward them along. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. That's a very important and valuable offer, actually, for anyone on the line to keep this conversation and dialogue going. And I'll offer the same opportunity as well. Jackie and Mona and Alice and others at the CCSN are actually very good at facilitating those kinds of questions after these webinars. So keep them coming. Thanks for the 100 delegates that logged on today and the almost 200 that signed up who are going to watch it later. Thank you very much for your interest and questions, and looking forward to the next one. Alison, back to you to finish us up.